Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. It's lovely to see so many people here at Resolution Foundation, and it's an absolute pleasure to be at the book launch in the week of publication of Diane's new book. So I'm sure we'll have a really interesting discussion. For those who are here today, instead of a 20% tariff on the book, we have a 20% discount. So do make sure you get your copy. And Diane will be signing them afterwards. As I'm sure you all know, Diane Coyle is Bennett Professor of Public Policy at the University of Cambridge. She's written many excellent books about the effects of digital technologies and, as you will know, the history of GDP. And her latest book is called The Measure of Progress, Counting What Really Matters. And we will be thoroughly recommending it to you today and having a good discussion of it. And I'm delighted to also be joined by Tara Alice, who's Chair of Pro Bono Economics and also on the Productivity Institute's Advisory Committee and many, many other things, but real expert on growth, productivity and public policy. So it's a real pleasure to have you at Resolution Foundation today. But without further ado, Diane, please tell us about this fascinating new book.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Tara, for grilling me or tearing me apart afterwards. So I usually start by making a joke about, who only the nerds care about statistics, but it's the nerds in the room, so I can start without the joke today. But it's a serious question. Why do we care about statistics, and why has it come to be a topic of so much interest of late? And one reason is that governments use them for monetary and fiscal and other policies, and so it guides policy decisions, guides business decisions too. In helpful timing, the Trump administration has brought statistics to the forefront. There's the figures, the tariffs today, of course, and it turns out, who knew that the United States has a deficit with the Marshall Islands, so the penguins there are getting a 10% tariff on their exports to the US. But a few weeks ago, Howard Lutnick, the new Commerce Secretary, talked about why would you not take the G out of GDP? Now, cynical people speculated that was because his colleague Elon Musk was doing so much to collapse the G, and so the growth figures without it would look much better than the growth figures with it. I think they should have thought about it a little bit, because if you're the only country taking the G out, you're going to make yourself look much worse by comparison with, say, China choosing another country at random. But it does raise the point that GDP is not a natural object. It's an idea. Its definition has changed over time. There's been a recent set of revisions of the system of national accounts that will change it a little bit again. But these are a reminder that statistics are not neutral things, they're political things. And in times of change or political contention and polarization, such as we have now, they become all the more hotly debated and important. And that's because the statistics that we use, that we're so familiar with thinking about the economy, embed the social and economic structure that has given rise to them. And they then become the targets that shape decisions that kind of reinforce those structures. And so, for example, Rachel Reeves' emphasis on growth, the current government's emphasis on growth, is putting a lot of pressure on those quarterly or monthly now GDP figures and the 0.1 or minus 0.1 that comes out. So, in a sense, data bias is inevitable even in macroeconomic statistics or other economic statistics. It's just inescapable that they both reflect the world that they describe and they shape the world that they describe. Now, GDP has, of course, long been criticised. I can recommend to you an excellent book published in 2014 called GDP, A Brief But Affectionate History, that talked about some of the long-standing critiques of GDP. So we're pretty familiar with some of those, the omission of the depletion of environmental resources at an unsustainable rate, externalities, caring, home activities such as caring. But it was still, it's still useful for macro policy. You would want to think about certainly nominal GDP and inflation. But the argument I make in this book is that it's decreasingly useful as a guide to either economic structure or as a measure of progress in some welfare sense. So we might still want it for some purposes, macro purposes, but for the other purposes for which we might want it, it's just a decreasingly useful metric. Now, the first several chapters talk about why the economy has become very hard to measure. And I start with the Harvard Economics Department picnic in 1981, I think, when I was a student there. And Zvi Grilikus is standing in the background behind some of my friends. So Zvi taught me, one of the people taught me econometrics. And in 1994, as president of the American Economic Association, he gave a talk and wrote a paper about why the economy and productivity had become so hard to measure. And he'd calculated that in 1947, that applied to about half the economy. It was areas where quality in particular was becoming a much more important variable in the utility that the products were delivering, and that was hard to measure. In his 94 article, he calculated that figure at 75% for the United States. These are US figures. And if you update it, which I do in a table here, it's 80%. So £4 in every 5, $4 in every 5 are hard to measure. And so there is some question about how much we're capturing. Well, what are we trying to capture with measures? Now, a lot of this is driven by digital and intangibles, obviously. If I cast right back to 1997, my first book was called The Weightless World, which was all about the way the share of value created in the economy was increasingly intangible. But in recent decades, past 20, 30 years, there have been enormous changes in the structure of the economy that are not being captured in the economic statistics. For example, the current government is interested in certain industrial sectors, AI, creative industries, life sciences. These don't have SIC codes that map onto them because the structure of the SIC codes that we have relates to a 20th century economy, not a now getting on for mid-21st century economy. If you think about supply chains, there are just all kinds of surprises, and with the tariff wars, we're going to find a lot more. Who knew that only 2 factories in the UK produced the carbon dioxide byproduct that was used in making beer and in food manufacturing? We're all aware now of the very tight bottlenecks in supply chains for advanced chips. But in something like auto manufacture, which is going to be hit hard by tariffs, there are very specialised companies in Poland, in the Czech Republic, in South Korea, producing components. And we don't have a good map of where these bottlenecks are. Actually, one of my favourites was during the pandemic when BioNTech wanted to get its new product into vials to be injected in people, and the only European supplier of the vials was in Northern Ireland. So they had to get bioactive material across the Irish Sea when we couldn't ship sausages because of Brexit. So lots of supply chain surprises. There are phenomena like factoryless goods production and servitization. So that's when companies that you think are manufacturing products aren't at all. It's all contracted out. Apple doesn't make iPhones. They're all contracted out. The Mercedes F-Class vehicles are all contracted out. Mercedes-Benz doesn't manufacture them. And then this phenomenon of servitization. Rolls-Royce makes fantastic aero engines, but it sells services around them. So companies, aircraft that have the engine can be monitored in real time as they fly. Problems can be identified early, and there are mutual benefits there because Rolls-Royce has the expertise and can produce this at low cost, produce service at low cost, and the airlines get a much safer and more convenient service. And so if you visit the factory in Derby, there are all these fantastic turbine halls and wind tunnels, and there's a hut in the corner with people sitting at computers, and that's generating most of the profits. There are phenomena like the use of data and cloud. How much data is there? How much is it worth? There aren't reliable statistics on that. How much are companies paying for cloud services? There isn't a price index. We've done one as a research project, but it's not been updated regularly. What about open source production and the value that's creating? You see substitutions from marketed products like Stata, which we economists have always used, to online free products like R and Python, which young economists now use. And then there are DIY services that we used to pay for by going to a travel agent or a bank, and now we can increasingly do those online ourselves. So there's some portion of that activity that's crossed the production boundary and is being done by households. And similarly, if you go into a supermarket and use an automatic checkout, labour that used to be conducted by paid humans is now being done by you. So it might be faster overall, but your free labour has substituted for the paid labour. So all of these phenomena, there's been a lot of research on. Rebecca, who is somewhere, Riley, director of ESCO, has led this fantastic research programme looking at some of these issues. But it's on the consumption side as well. The free digital services that we use, how should we account for those in a price index? What about bundles of goods? If you think about the price of the services you get in your iPhone, mine is over there, I hope it's turned off. That's a combination of the phone, the data package, the content that you get on there, but also the services of your ISP and the services of the telecommunications network. There are choices to be made about how you construct a price index for the telecommunications services that are almost impossible because the value that we get as consumers is mainly in the content. And some of that will be paid for and some of that will be free, and it's not accounted for separately. So all of these phenomena, which have obsessed me for decades now, are raising questions about value distribution. Where is the value being created and who is getting it? And the row about AI and copyright is only the latest example of these, but you can look back at what's happened to the news industry, or you can look at things like the potential for digital twins in transport services that creates value across the whole value chain, but who's going to get that value? It crystallizes in more reliable train services, maybe, at one end, but how is that going to get fed back through the contractual relationships up the supply chain? John Deere tractors, General Motors cars, and certainly your Tesla, have the ability to stop you driving. They're using your data. They would claim that they own that data, and in effect that you're leasing the car and the data services from them. So what should we do about this? One thing we might do is collect a lot more data. All the big companies derive a lot of value from their data. There's no reason to think that the public collection of data should not be equally valuable. We would have to use new methods, though, I think, because as people know well, the response rates to surveys are declining quite substantially. Elon Musk now has his hands on all of the commercial private data in the United States, so companies there ain't going to be filing anymore. So the survey method, I think, is reaching its end. So thinking about new methods, collecting new data, that's an obvious thing to ask for. And indeed, Charles Bean, sitting in the front row here, asked for it in 2016, and we haven't, I think, made a lot of progress on that front. I argue in the book that a useful lens to think about this in a systematic way is time, because it's an accounting framework. There are 24 hours in a day, they've got to be used up, and you can think about it from both the production and the consumption side. Productivity is often speeding things up, from Adam Smith's pin factory to steamships to just-in-time production to Walmart's logistic chains. A lot of the productivity gains have come through improved speed. You can think about it the other way as well, though, because for services or products where quality really matters, which is a high proportion now, then the amount of quality skilled labour time that goes into those is going to be a marker of, I'm not sure I can call it productivity, but a marker of the value that's being created. And that might get reflected in the price. So a high price there is a quality signal rather than an inflation signal. So maybe we need to think about the number of skilled hours in those kinds of contexts. You can think about it on the consumer side as well. We live in an attention economy. Lots of things are competing for our time. Traditionally, economists have thought about paid work and leisure as the two categories, but we perhaps need to think about time to produce, which might be paid or unpaid, and time to consume would be a different way of carving that up. The second thing that I argue for is thinking about progress over time and sustainability widely understood, and advocate for a comprehensive wealth, which is a way of saying a national balance sheet that includes a wide range of different assets. Natural capital is the one where statistical agencies have made most progress, human capital if you include health, but also traditional physical capital, measuring better what technology is embodied in physical capital. How well is it maintained? How well is the infrastructure maintained? Where is the infrastructure? And these matter because they reflect the production capacity of the economy over the long term. So GDP is a demand-side metric. It comes from Keynes's theory of aggregate demand. It's still useful for aggregate demand. What I'm really advocating for is a much better supply-side framework to think about productivity, creation of value longer term, and increasingly actually security longer term as well, because I think we're in a world where we can see there's a lot of uncertainty, potential for crisis. So this isn't a quick project. Obviously, I've written the book to keep myself in work for the next 10 years, so I can carry on doing all of this. But that's a quick overview of what it says. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. Well, a fantastic overview, and I'm so pleased that you gave us just a few of some of the wonderful kind of stories and anecdotes that really bring it to life in the book, which make it a real pleasure to read. But Tara, what did you make of it?
Well, thank you so much, first of all, for inviting me to be here and to provide some comments and some remarks on Diane's wonderful book. As you would expect, she's very eloquent in the book. She's been very eloquent now in essentially laying out a really important argument around how we need to do a wholesale change, I think, in terms of how we think about measuring progress. And that's really what I'm going to focus on. There's lots and lots of really exciting and interesting detail in Diane's book also about these new phenomena that are making measuring really, really difficult. But there's a meta question around how should we even measure progress, which I think Diane provides some really interesting ideas on, and I want to talk a bit about those. Before I do recommend everybody to read it, but beware that it comes with a health warning. If you spend a lot of your time with GDP statistics or some of the related statistics and spend your life commentating on those, this book may seriously harm your confidence and it may make you question your life choices. Having said that, I still recommend it because we'd rather know what's underneath. I mean, honestly, actually, occasionally I think ignorance is bliss. I spend a lot of time with data, and sometimes when I look underneath the bonnet, I wish I hadn't looked, honestly. But in the spirit of actually wanting to know what's actually going on in the economy, I think it's very, very worthwhile understanding all of those challenges with GDP. I only have a few minutes, so I'm going to focus on three messages. First of all, why is GDP just hopelessly outdated way of measuring things, and particularly a very bad measure of any kind of social welfare? Secondly, I want to comment on Diane's point about comprehensive wealth statistics or wealth accounting, which I think conceptually is really brilliant, but I have some concerns about practicality. And I want to come on to the time measure, which I think has massive potential. And I think hopefully we'll be able to put a lot more research effort into that in the future. So starting with GDP, it's a real source of concern to me that when I speak to my civil service colleagues now, with the government having said growth is their absolutely key priority, that they are speaking about policy very much in terms of, does it add to GDP? That's never how GDP was meant to be used. That's where you use social cost-benefit analysis. It's even more concerning that they are not just talking about that, but they're talking about, will the OBR score it? So not just will it add to GDP, but will OBR score it? That's like 2 levels reduced from what I think we should be doing in terms of social cost-benefit analysis. So that is scary. And I wonder if a lot of those people do know what's actually embedded in GDP. I do understand that we can't just do bottom-up cost-benefit analysis. We do need some kind of overall measure of progress, but it's clear, it's just so obvious that there's so many things missing from GDP that are valuable as well as negative. And actually here I do disagree slightly with Diane, because in her book she says we're all much poorer than we think. I actually think we're all much richer than we think. GDP doesn't measure leisure time. We have a ton more of that than previously. GDP doesn't measure health and improved healthy life expectancy. And we're all much better off on that front than several years ago. It doesn't measure consumer surplus in many cases. In some cases it does. And I think there's enormous consumer surplus, especially for the free of charge services that Diane talks about. it doesn't measure home production, which is a huge chunk of what we all do, and we produce very valuable things when we're at home, looking after children or cooking or taking them to sports lessons or whatever else it might be. It obviously doesn't include a lot of negative stuff as well, and we need to worry about that. Environmental degradation being a particularly key one. Now, I don't claim to have quantified any of this, but I did ask ChatGPT and a couple of other chatbots to give me an estimate. Rightly, Gemini refused to give me an estimate. She or he was clear about the fact that you can't just add these things like that. And once you move away from GDP into social welfare, you're kind of counting apples and oranges, fine. But the other chatbots didn't give me an estimate. And they suggested that if we were to add all of these positive things and take out all the negative things, maybe we'd be talking about a GDP twice as much as we've got today. Well, who knows? But my instinct is that we are better off than the GDP statistics suggest. But that's a point for us to debate. However, what's clear to me from Diane's book, and generally, is that looking at a flow metric is a bit nonsensical. And therefore, the stocks idea, the idea of looking at assets and wealth, is fundamentally, conceptually much more defensible. It's much more helpful in thinking about sustainability, and it's much more important in terms of things like productivity and what the value that people get from their lives on this planet. What I worry about here particularly is that, having spent a lifetime doing net present value calculations either in government or in business, you can tweak the numbers to give you any number you want by changing the discount rate or the growth rate or the shadow prices. So how we're ever going to come to a kind of consensus of what those right numbers should be and could be is going to take time, and I think requires quite a lot of continued sort of discussion and debate. I do think Diane's idea about using time as an accounting framework has enormous potential. It's just so intuitive. Everybody has 24 hours, as Diane said. You have to spend them and you have no more. It doesn't matter how rich or how you're poor, that's exactly what you've got. And obviously, as chief economist at DFT, as I used to be, I totally buy into the idea of value of time. It's clear that people in their daily lives, they value time. They're willing to pay for speedy boarding or for ready meals or a taxi home or whatever it is. And so there's both empirically and conceptually a lot of kind of rich material here. And of course, as Diane says, it's also at the fundamental core of labour productivity. Is what do you actually get done? What output do you deliver? What value do you deliver for each of the units of time that you've got available? As chair of Pro Bono Economics, I'm also super interested in the whole well-being literature and also subjective well-being. And we know that how people spend their time is enormously important. Who they're with, where they are, what they're actually doing, has a huge impact on whether they feel happy or unhappy in that moment in time, whether they're satisfied or unsatisfied, and what sort of memories get created, which are also quite important for people's well-being. So I think it's a hugely rich agenda to explore. And, you know, there's already some really exciting research on this. The Mappiness project, I'm sure some of you have heard of it, has been able to start putting values on time. So on average, people are willing to pay an extra £10 for singing or performing, which is what I do in the choir. I've told my choir director that we should charge much more because people's willingness to pay is much higher than what we're actually charging them at the moment. That's a little slightly cynical economist take on that fact. Whereas watching TV is worth £2 an hour, working is worth -8, which is kind of interesting, a lot less negative than what we actually all get paid for an hour. So there's some inherent value in working. Being sick in bed is worth -46 an hour. So I wonder if you started using that as a metric for the NHS, what we would actually try and do to the health service. I'm not saying those are the right numbers. I guess what I'm trying to point out, the context really matters for valuation, but also these are real numbers in the sense that they make sense, and we can start, you know, a much bigger research agenda on this in order to put value on time. Final thing I'll say about time is what's fascinating about this LSE research is a lot of the things that people value the most, you know, reflecting in nature, meditating, socializing, cost no money. So they will not show up on GDP whatsoever. And yet these are some of the most valuable things people feel that they're doing in their lives. So I think it's intuitively also going in the right direction there. So I'll finish off just by saying it's a huge agenda. There's a lot to talk about. There's a lot of debates to be had. We've spent 80 years, I think, perfecting how we measure GDP. It's pretty terrible. I hope that we spend the next 80 years perfecting some of these other measures which are more meaningful.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tara. So look, loads to talk about, and lots of you have come in person. So we'll take questions. I'm going to be cheeky and ask one. I'd really like to put Tara's point to you, which I wanted to ask about whether to feel better or worse at the end of your book, because there's a sort of first section where you talk about lots of things that are missing, as Tara says, from the measure that made me feel good, and maybe productivity and living standards are a bit better than we thought. And then you have this very striking sentence that we're all poorer than we think you are when we look at the balance sheet. What's your take on that, Diane?
I think I'm with Gemini, and that you can't compare apples and oranges. And yet we do, in any price index, we assume that things are substitutable. So we say, there's an apple and there's a, that's an apple too. And it's not. So one of the appeals of the comprehensive wealth approach is that actually you don't have to combine them all into one metric. But of course the one metric is incredibly powerful.
Who would like to ask a question? Who's feeling brave? If not, I can just keep going, but there we go. So, do you mind just waiting for the microphone so people online can hear? Sorry, thank you.
So I'm Liz Hind. I work for the Women's Budget Group. So we do economic analysis for, differences between men and women. So obviously accounting for unpaid care and supporting unpaid carers is something that we think about a lot. Now, some of the approaches that we're taking at the moment is to try and put a monetary value on that unpaid care. So the latest figure I heard was 180 billion. And yet unpaid carers reject that because they say, well, you're only spending 3.8 billion on carers allowance. So do you actually value our time and our value and contribution to the economy? And, I have to side with them and say, I don't know whether we do. And we don't really understand still kind of how their work affects productivity of other people and enabling that. So, I think that's a long-winded way of trying to get to a question that says, in your new frameworks, Diane, is there a better way in which we can understand the contribution of unpaid carers in a way in which we have public policy which drives support to them so that they are not suffering from health defects from having to do full-time care?
Good question, and obviously it's one that's been debated for a long time. So the literature about unpaid care goes back a ways. I think 1934 was Margaret Reed's book. I think you should go to what people are doing with their time before you start thinking about how do you value the time. And so the first thing that we would want policymakers to know is how many caring hours are needed in the economy. And then you can start thinking about are there monetary trade-offs involved? And they can go both ways. I just read a really interesting book called Wages for Housework about the campaign in the 1970s, which eventually split because there was a difference of view about whether that was actually a bid to get wages for housework, or whether it was better to recognise its inherent value and not make it part of the capitalist economy. So I think that you've pointed out a real dilemma in terms of monetary value, but we should know about what people do with their time, be it unpaid care or writing R packages that they make freely available on the internet.
And I heard you talk interestingly on a podcast about the kind of how the invention of washing machines would score very differently from the invention of kind of improvements in factory production. Do you want to say a bit about that?
Here's a reason for optimism. So there's a fantastic Hans Rosling TED talk where he talks about the washing machine as the greatest invention of the 20th century because it freed up so much women's time to do other things like play with their kids. I was in Stanford 2 or 3 weeks ago looking at robots. And they do seem to have brought together the electronics, the physics of the robots, and the fine manipulation to create a robot that can fold up your laundry for you. So having been a little bit sceptical, I now think robotics might actually be the use case for generative AI because it involves Gen AI models. And this kind of thing, the cost could come down really quickly, and that would free up so much of our time. It's fantastic.
Well, there's a good reason for optimism. Did you want to add anything on
Just, I want to echo what Ian said. There is a lot of research saying that once you monetize things, they lose a lot of the inherent value in them. And so I would be very careful of that. You know, in the abstract, we sometimes do need to put these kind of big numbers on things, but comparing them in those ways is probably a bit misleading. And you know, I actually, this LSE study is interesting. Playing with children has quite a big positive value on it, according to the Mappiness data. I'm sure, I mean, that housework and chores, I don't have it down here in my little list of things that I gathered, because they measured like 35 different activities. Pretty sure if it's just a chore, it'll score very negatively. So the context really matters.
Interesting. We've had one question online, which I'm not going to attempt to bring up because it's too late in the evening for technology, but I'll read it out because I think it might be on a lot of people's minds. So the review of the ONS that was announced a few days ago, so Robert Devereux's been asked to do a review of the ONS, and it's great to have Charlie Bean here of previous statistics reviews. So they speculate, this questioner, that the review is likely to say that the ONS need to focus on getting the basics like GDP figures right. And obviously we've had challenges with, you mentioned issues with surveys, and the ONS have had challenges with the labour force survey and other things. And the question is, does this threaten the innovative work we want to do? And I guess I had a related question about how should the ONS prioritise now this kind of restoring some of the old statistics versus innovation?
So I would argue for more funding for ONS. If we think data is valuable, if AI runs on data, then public data matters as well as private data. So I think it's underfunded. Like any big organisation, it's very hard for any big organisation. I was a BBC trustee for several years. Trying to get them to stop doing something so they can prioritise something else is really, really difficult. So I've got a lot of sympathy with that. But I would like to see them stop doing things like monthly GDP. I mean, for heaven's sake, it's only for the city. They've got economists, they can do it themselves. And go to the innovation and looking at the digital sector.
Really interesting. You okay with dropping monthly GDP?
I'm totally okay for dropping. I mean, it creates just such a vast amount of unnecessary noise. Was it negative 0.1 or positive 0.1? Absolutely. We know that the error margin around is much bigger than that, and there's at no point in kind of polishing that particular number. I think in general, I suspect that if one were to go through all of what the ONS does, there would be a fair number of areas where if one had to make prioritization decisions, one would probably drop some of those. And I don't think it can be an either or. I think it has to be you have to keep producing important statistics in the here and now. You have to keep on the reform agenda and the future agenda as well. Because where else are we going to, I mean, we are otherwise going to have this same debate in 10 years' time and in 50 years' time, and we're going to say, oh, if only in 2025 we'd realised that we need to invest a lot more in this kind of data. Yeah. So we can't afford to, I think, not invest now.
Great. I know we've got a question over there, and if anyone else would like to ask a question, I can take a couple at the same time.
Thanks. I'd like to ask you to say a bit more about the time issue. I'm not an economist nor a statistician, but I did a long time ago run an organisation, the Social Studies of Time. Whilst it's obviously true that there are 24 hours in a day, some people's 24 hours last a lot longer, or they get a lot more out of them. In particular, the issue of what the relationship between education, or human capital as you called it, and time use, and how you'd go about measuring that or bringing that into your calculations.
Does anyone want to add one? Andrew?
Hi, thank you, Diane. It was very interesting. My question was, is a way forward, do we need a single metric, or would we be better off using a suite of metrics and, serving different purposes and perhaps being clearer about which metric is good for which use?
Do you want to
do those two? I hadn't really thought about education and time use. So are you driving at the fact that when educated people are working, they're being more productive? Is that what's behind it?
Well, that's one obvious line in, but it's actually also how you conceive of your own time use, how far you conceive of value of time as being something valuable to yourself.
So
How far you've then got the skills to translate that into something that's valuable to you and to other people.
So for those online, the second half was how valuable is your use of time to you yourself. So that bit, I think, goes to the well-being measures. And you could think of trying to measure aggregate well-being in the economy as all of the hours people spend doing different things and the well-being they get out of each of those. Would be one potential way of thinking about that. I don't know if less educated people get less value out of how they spend their time. I think that's an empirical matter, and I don't know the answer to that. On the single metric versus the suite, previously I've been against dashboards because they're a bit ad hoc. People choose a bunch of things that are good and they put them in there and they proliferate, and we end up with 385 sub-indicators for the SDGs. And you can't use that, really. You can focus in on something that's interesting to you, but as a handle on how the economy as a whole is going or society as a whole is going, it's not very useful. One of the reasons I like comprehensive wealth is that it's about 6 headings. So, and it's got theory behind it, and I know it's really good theory because my colleague Partha Dasgupta and Ken Arrow invented it, and so I would hope it would appeal to economists and statisticians as a way of getting a bit beyond the one figure, but in quite a systematic way. Having said that, the one figure is so powerful politically, isn't it? Countries like to rank themselves on that. Governments like to focus on this quarter or this month's change in GDP. So there's some kind of social psychology question in it as well.
Yeah, and we had a question online about why do governments cling to GDP, and I don't know what you think, Tara, but it does feel like this one number thing is very compelling for us all.
It is very compelling, but it's also hugely misleading. We all know that wrong decisions are being made on a daily basis by people clinging to the one number, and I have to say that I used to love the idea of one number. I think if you'd asked me 5 years ago, I thought we would still be able to come up with a one number from a well-being perspective, like life satisfaction or something like that. But having explored it a bit more, I have to admit that I don't think we can. But I agree totally with that. That would have been exactly my answer. You need a handful of really important things, chunky things that matter to people's lives that you're going to be measuring. If it's more than 10, forget about it. But trying to collapse it all into one number, I think you just end up doing real damage. You have to kind of squeeze apples and oranges into the same measurement framework, and however conceptually sound you think it is, it's just a bit nonsensical, I think, at the end of the day. I wanted to comment briefly on the point about education and time, not so much about the education aspect of it, but Diane's response to it, which is we can find out how people value their time, but we also need to remember that that's very driven by how much choice they had over that. And so, when we start approaching the measurement issues around value of time, I think you'll find, for example, the example around, household chores or, childcare or unpaid care work. The people who are willing to doing it and getting real pleasure out of it, they will value it as a positive thing. And the people who are doing it because they absolutely have to do it and they have no choice, probably value it negatively. And so we'll also have to accept that there's going to be massive heterogeneity around these values. That then poses some questions for how we do the analysis, which calls for distributional type analysis and calls for much more granularity, which is what we should have been calling for the last 80 years anyway. So let's keep calling for it.
And on kind of well-being measures and digital, Diane, can I ask you to tell us a bit about some of the evidence in the book on social media, which I just found fascinating, about whether it's sort of added to our well-being or not, and some of the studies on Facebook?
Yes, so there's a growing number of these studies now, and Eric Brynjolfsson at Stanford is rolling these out sort of worldwide to get some international comparisons. And so I did a study here in the UK, a survey of 10,000 people before the start of the pandemic, and another one in May after the start of the pandemic. So the world gave us a wonderful natural experiment in how much people do value free online goods. And it was very intuitive. The value of online shopping went up a lot. The value of public parks, because we included some non-digital goods in there, also went up a lot. The distributions were interesting. For many digital goods, there are super users with very high values, and a lot of people who assign really low values and don't use it very much. There are two exceptions. One was search, and one was personal email, and they have a much more normal kind of distribution. So that's all really interesting and kind of intuitive. There are other studies of Facebook that show, first of all, quite a wide range. It seems to be culturally specific. Second, if you have incentive-compatible experiments and you take Facebook away, that people are not bothered. So the addiction thing is clearly a real phenomenon with social media.
Now, I think there's a question at the end that I couldn't see. Sorry for that, so we'll take that one.
Thank you. Yes. So my question was in regards to how higher and lower income people value things. And sort of course, like if we're talking about valuing time, someone with a higher income might conceptualize a high cost as being a lot higher than somebody with a lower income. And I'm sort of thinking about the effects of that on issues that disproportionately affect people in different income brackets, especially when it comes to public policy. If we think, for example, cancer, if we think of a cancer symptom where cancer disproportionately affects people of higher incomes compared to, for example, heart disease, which affects people of lower incomes, you might have very drastic distributions or differences in how people sort of cost the time value of that symptom, which could lead to, public policy decisions that affect distribution negatively.
And Tara, you mentioned cost-benefit analysis. What do you think about how you reflect on these distributional issues?
So that's a really, really important question. I think I possibly didn't explain myself very clearly. I wouldn't trust willingness to pay studies very much, because I think they do suffer a lot from the kind of context in which a person. I was talking to someone earlier today who said, oh, that person giving us £50,000 is like me buying a bottle of water. So for some people, literally, that is the frame they're in. I wish. So you don't ask them about the value, the monetary value. You ask them about how well they felt, how happy they were, what satisfaction they got out of the activity. And you look at revealed preference and you adjust for it. You basically look at all kinds of people in the society and you make sure that you're looking at a representative sample before you start making any decisions. I think, yes, when I was the Department for Transport, we had a single value of time, which is just so completely ridiculous. We can't have a single value for these things because it's going to be different for different people at different times. And so it's not that difficult to have even a spreadsheet, let alone some kind of Python program that can deal with a bit more complexity than that.
And what about the distribution, Diane? And can I add, I really wanted to ask you, since we're at the Resolution Foundation and we have a living standards mission, what you think all this kind of complexity about GDP means for how we measure living standards. The government has a growth mission, which also describes a living standards mission, but it uses GDP per capita for that. And after reading your book, I'm sort of wondering whether that's the right measure.
GDP doesn't do distribution either, it's averages, and so there's been some work on looking at democratic measures of GDP, adjusting for different income groups. And of course, the CPI, the price index, doesn't account for the fact that people on low and high incomes have very different purchasing patterns. But we assume that they're substitutable. We're assuming that you can substitute being on Facebook for eating your breakfast. And that's just a fundamental problem with how we've constructed the idea of price indices. Sorry, I've forgotten the question now. I've started rabbiting on about price indices, my favourite subject.
I mean, it's really a pleasure to hear you talk about price indices. So feel free to do that. There was a question about in thinking about the time concept and how we think about distribution within that. And then I added a question about whether GDP per capita is a good measure of living standards.
Oh no, GDP per capita is obviously not. First of all, you'd want the median if you're going to use it at all. But secondly, we get a lot of value from public assets. So this is why people care about potholes and the trains not running. And if you want to make people feel better about their living standards, you would get the trains running and fix the roads. So that does come into GDP. You know, government spending is in GDP, but it's not a direct feed through into, you know, if GDP per capita goes up, everybody feels better about their living standards.
Yeah, yeah. A question at the front. See, now we're short of time. You've all got questions. This is always the problem.
Just a brief question. Would you like to say more about how you would reintroduce or introduce properly externalities in the economic costs? The changes to the system of accounting you're proposing, I believe, has a major component on sustainability.
If you measure physical assets, you would then want to value them using some price concept. And what the national accounts and the environmental extension does is use exchange value, something close to a concept of market price. If there were a market, what would the price be? You would use that value. To capture the externalities, you need to use shadow prices, what economists call shadow prices. And I have, as it happens, a postdoc working on a project exactly to figure out how do you think about what's the right concept of a shadow price to take into account externalities. So there isn't a settled way to do it, but it's something that researchers are thinking about. And this is another of Rebecca's ESCO projects.
Did you want to add anything?
No.
No. There's one behind you, Emily, and one at the back. Maybe we can take both of those together.
I'll be super quick. I'm an economist working on the industrial strategy, but in my previous life and by training, I'm an economic historian. Obviously, I've heard lots of variations of this talk over the years about how we measure living standards in the past. But because we have prices and we have wages and whatever, we can use GDP. What do you say to economic historians now if we shouldn't be using that at all?
I think once you're an economic historian, you're always an economic historian, aren't you? It's a vocation. So I love these historical time series of GDP, but I'm also quite suspicious of them. Casting back that concept when the production structure and the consumption structure of the economy was so different doesn't really make a lot of sense. So, but if it correlates well with things like height and longevity, then it's probably good enough for those long-term comparisons. We're never going to be able to compare properly, you know, the well-being and living standards of somebody in ancient Rome and somebody now.
Yeah, I think I would say, yes, you can look at those GDP statistics and focus on them, but you also need to look at leisure time. It's a huge thing we don't count, and it's a huge value that we now have, and you need to look at health. So that links to Diane's point about height and, you know, whatever statistics you can get on mortality, morbidity. Those are the big missing things. I mean, there's lots missing, but those are the really, really, really big ones.
Should we take the one on the back?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the talk. Really, really fascinating. Really look forward to reading the book. My name's Luke Hilliard. I work for the High Pay Centre think tank, and we do a lot of work analysing corporate reporting. So I was just wondering if you think there are any implications for from this agenda for measuring the performance of non-major economic, non-state actors like large businesses and other entities like that?
That's an interesting question. I was talking to Ruth beforehand about a task I've set one of our research assistants, which is to look at what proportion of US GDP growth in recent times can be attributed to monopoly profits of the tech sector, because it has grown faster than other G7 economies. But my hypothesis would be that some of that is, if you like, artificial because of that monopoly profit.
And I was saying to Diane that if anyone's particularly interested in US productivity, there's an event here on Tuesday comparing US and UK productivity. So if you'd like to come back soon, please do.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the positive side of things on the corporate side is nobody worries about anything real. They accept that there's only this thing called cash, and cash is king, and that's what we're going to count. And the nice thing about cash is you can literally see it coming into your account or going out of your account, and that's it. And so you don't worry about deflators, you don't worry about inflation, like as a kind of try to adjust the metrics. And I think it gives it a sense of reality. Now, valuations are still going to be up and down and completely irrational based on what discount rates people are using and what implicitly they're thinking other people are using in the market. So I think it's a kind of different kettle of fish in many ways. But I think Diane's point is really interesting. Where do they intersect? is obviously an important question. I actually had a question, Diane, for you, because like I was brought up thinking increasing returns are good. You know, we get more bang for our buck, and your book does definitely talk about them in a negative way, which I understand from a monopoly profit perspective. There's a huge issues around concentration, huge issues around competition. So do you see any, is it always like a bad thing to have increasing returns?
No, I'm surprised that it comes across as being a bad thing. I mean, clearly there are markets where increasing returns translate into monopoly power, market power, and that's why we have regulation and competition policy. But economic growth is increasing returns, and urban agglomeration is increasing returns.
Yes.
So I think the economy is increasing returns.
So it's probably, I've just misinterpreted
It's all about
how I read it.
How do you share the value that gets created from it?
To wrap us up, can I ask you both sort of, there's this very ambitious agenda that you lay out in the book, and I think it'll keep many people employed for at least another decade. But what's the sort of next step that you think would really kind of help us on the journey? What would you call for as a first step?
So the challenge in getting away from looking at a metric, GDP, that a lot of people think is flawed and increasingly badly flawed, is to have them agree about what you're doing instead. It's like a technical standard, or with 3 pin plugs versus 2 pin plugs, you've got to have something to go to. So I do think the next steps is to carry on this conversation, and I've proposed a couple of things. One of them is more novel, time stuff is more novel, the comprehensive wealth stuff is very well known. Maybe they're things that we can build some consensus around.
How about for you, Tara?
Yeah, I think doing more research on the time aspect is a no regret, because I can only see that generating a lot of value. Even if we don't replace GDP with that anytime soon, it'll give us so much insight into how people are spending their time, choosing so or having to choose so because of circumstances, and what value they're getting out of it. That it's something that we should do more and we should do better. And at the moment, I think our time use surveys are absolutely terrible. So we can definitely improve on those to start with.
And to give the people what we want before we finish, how is Sophie the dog? Can we have an update?
Sophie's very well, thank you. She was a bit naughty the other night and jumped over the garden wall chasing a fox, but eventually we got her back.
Well, Diane, Tara, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.